We're on to the next chapter in my book, Not a Victim, a Survivor, Life Beyond Domestic Violence and Rape. It's part of a series that I did, Life Beyond Silence. And I'm hoping the podcast gives you an opportunity to hear directly from me. You can, of course, buy the published version of my book on Amazon, and it also has the e-reader purchase too. So you can purchase the e-reader book or the actual book itself on Amazon. So, um, there this episode is going to be very difficult. It gives you an idea of what started to be my second marriage and how we met and how it progressed. So, after I divorced Matt and was living with my mother, um, okay, so the way um, I met my second husband was oddly normal. One day I was home from work while my mother wasn't there, and I remember she had ordered the cable to be installed. And I know I probably looked like shit. After all, I'd been working night shift at a nursing home after I had came back home and divorced Matt. I went to the door only to find one of my old boyfriends was the cable man, or one of the cable men. And he was shocked to find me living with my mom. He learned that I was recently divorced and was working. And the other guy that was with him knew me, but I didn't know him. I didn't even get a good look at him. He had a stocking cap on, and he was sporting the full beard, and he had flannel and blue jeans. But as far as like paying attention to him, I was talking to my ex-boyfriend, and I knew he seemed handsome enough, and he was really outdoorsman type. But I didn't say anything to him. I was just kept on talking to my ex about the old times in high school and things like that. And later on, I received a phone call from this guy who had been out with my friend Tracy, and his name was Walker. He asked if I'd like to go out for dinner, and to be honest, I eagerly accepted, and told my mother when she came home. "Did you tell him you were pregnant?" she said. And I remember saying, "No, I didn't. I didn't even think that would require telling him just because we were going out for dinner. And if we start dating, of course, I'll tell him." She nodded and she said, "Be careful." She said I knew Walker, and she did, and he had a much worse reputation than I did. I didn't think much about reputations because, of course, mine had been overly exaggerated. I don't remember much about that evening, just that Walker was a year older than Matt, my ex-husband, and I remember he was all dressed up and very good looking, and he had lots of charm, and he seemed very intelligent. I didn't really want to jump into anything with someone, so I kind of pulled away, not wanting to be hurt. Not to mention, I was positive Walker wouldn't want anything to do with me once I told him I was pregnant. I don't remember when it was I did tell him about the baby. I just remember when I did, he said, hold on a second. He said he understood and he wasn't turned off by it. I wasn't even showing, and he thought by the time I was, we would both know where this relationship was going. Walker could make his decision about how he felt then. He did say it was a small town and there'd be lots of talk. I told him I would understand if he didn't want to see me anymore, and I remember he said, let's just give it some time. He really didn't care too much about what anyone said anyway. Just wasn't that kind of guy. Walker said he thought I was beautiful and my little girl was adorable. He had 2 kids of his own, and strangely enough, he had custody of them just like my ex-husband. However, they lived at his parents' home. I remember I was shocked at his reaction about the pregnancy. Why did he care? Why was he going to stay? I remember I thought he must have already started to care about me. I knew after dating him for a while that he had a drinking problem, but I didn't consider it a real issue. I knew the story on his kids was very similar to my ex-husband. After all, his wife had basically just left, leaving him with 2 small children. Then Walker's mom and his dad had stepped in and offered to help raise them. Logan was 9 years old and Emily was 13. I wasn't really around them much at first because there had been some harsh words said between Walker and his mother about me. She knew of my predicament and definitely didn't approve. Walker said his mother would eventually accept his decision and it would be okay. I met her once or twice at the beginning, and I always felt as though she was looking right through me, like I was the enemy, trying to saddle her son with 2 kids, neither of which was his. On April 30th, 1983, my second little girl was born. It had been raining a lot, and the roads were flooded. We live in a rural area, and so he had to take a detour to the hospital. My mom said that I couldn't be in labor, it was too early, but I insisted that he drive me to the hospital. Mom said to call her if I was truly in labor and they were going to let me deliver. After all, I was right at 6 weeks early. I had the same doctor and was at the same hospital as before. I remember they let Walker sit with me in the labor room. It was much better than before. I had someone with me to hold my hand. I got tickled when Walker said it was the first time for him because with his other 2 they didn't allow the dads in. He had to sit in the waiting room and didn't participate. Walker was so funny. He kept asking questions and his hands were shaking. My doctor came in and wanted to stop my labor because it was early, but as he started to leave, my water broke, and the doctor said, looks like the baby wants to be born after all, like it or not. I don't remember too much else after that. I just remember we called my mother, and the nurses kind of hurried to get me prepped for surgery. After all, this was going to be another C-section birth, and I was fixing to deliver a very premature baby. I remember I was scared but excited at the same time. I remember it seemed to go very fast, and in minutes I was counting backwards and drifting off to sleep. My second daughter, not to get confused, but it will be confusing, their initials are the same, BB. She was born April 30th, 1983, weighing only 5 pounds, 5 ounces. I remember when I woke up, they couldn't tell me anything. So they just didn't tell me anything. They did tell me that she was a little girl and that she was small but mighty. And then I remember floating back off to sleep. Um, I remember thinking, though, something was wrong because they weren't giving me more specifics about the baby. Um, and the next time I had woken up, it was early in the morning, and I was confused why nobody had brought the baby to me. I called for the nurse, and I remember her saying the doctor would be coming in to talk to me as soon as he got there to make his rounds. I was scared. What had happened? Nobody was telling me anything. When my doctor got there, he told me that my second daughter had been 6 weeks early and she was having a lot of trouble breathing on her own. However, she was strong and bigger than most preemies, so the outlook was really good. For now, though, she needed a lot. She was in a lot of distress, and she had lots of tubes and wires. The doctor said that um, my daughter was doing really good overall. He also didn't want me to go down to see her unless I had someone with me. And I couldn't breastfeed her right this second because they had to get her stable. The doctor did say that he wanted me to use the breast pump and told me the nurses would feed it to her through her feeding tube. I was horrified. Please, God, don't let anything happen to my baby. Don't let her be taken from me, please. Walker took me up to the nursery when he got there, and they let us go in together. All I remember is I could touch her toes. She was so tiny. She seemed so frail and was surrounded by all kinds of monitors and equipment. Walker said that when she was born and they rushed her up from surgery, he'd gotten a small glimpse of her and she was blue. He said they were all working on her and someone had even come for him to sign some papers, but of course he couldn't, so my mother did. Walker also said that he had been really nervous. Something might happen to her. The doctor told them that he was going to keep me knocked out until morning, and then after he got there, he would tell me. That way I wouldn't get so upset. I stayed in the hospital for a week, but I knew I would end up having to leave her for a little while. And to be honest, that was so hard. Um, my daughter was in there a total of 17 days in the neonatal intensive care, or NICU, which is what they're commonly called. I remember it was excruciating to leave without her, but I knew she was in good hands. And although she was a little tough little cookie, I didn't want to be far from her. I actually kind of nicknamed her Bird because she looked like a little bird that had just come out of an egg. She hardly had any hair. She didn't have any fingernails, just nail beds. But she just looked so like little chicken, kind of laying there, all scrunched up. And I remember my mother still says to this day, I was horrible coming home from the hospital. I did try to go back every day though, or every other day, and I did pump, and I was quite excited when they finally let me breastfeed her. Um, I remember just calling every morning, because you could call every morning and they give you an update. But having Walker around helped quite a bit. He kind of acted like he was her daddy. When I found out I could go pick her up, I called Walker at work and he got off early so we could go get her. We drove up, and he was like a new dad. We talked all the way about our future, and he said he wanted to stay with me. He wanted desperately to be there and to be a dad to my kids. Walker said we should get married, and something told me eventually we would. When I think about Walker, I remember a man 11 years older than me who was good looking and hard working, but I finally did accept the fact that he was an alcoholic, just as my first husband. But he was also an extremely addicted to pain medicine. He had been covered up in the mines years ago, and it resulted in having a severe back injury, and he was still in the process of suing them for the accident when we had gotten together. I knew he took Demerol and Tylenol 4s. He took Talwin. He took just about any pain medicine, actually, but I thought it was just basically because of his injury. And I didn't know at first that he was abusing them, not until much later. To be honest, it was a huge problem, and he kept it from me until after we were married. Don't get me wrong, he was a good man and a good father, but the minute anyone mixes liquor and drugs of any kind, especially pain meds, well, you guess it, it changes them. It changes their mood. It changes their actions, because they don't. If they're really addicted to pain medicine and they're an alcoholic, they're taking far too much of both things, and so basically he would just be in another world. I just kept kidding myself that if we both worked on it, he'd be able to get off the drugs, and then we could work on the alcohol. We ultimately got an apartment and started living together. The lawsuit he had about the mine accident finally settled, and we decided to get married as soon as he got his check and go on a long romantic honeymoon. I remember the whole trip was beautiful. We went to Puerto Vallarta, Mexico for a week. Then we stopped by in Las Vegas and saw my dad. It was like a dream vacation, a dream honeymoon. We were on top of the world, and our little girl, my second daughter, was about 6 months old by the time we finally tied the knot. And she was at home with my other daughter and his 2 kids. So, we had literally everything going for us. We had both pledged that this would be a new beginning for us, a new chance to start over. Things started getting out of control, however, the minute we got back from the honeymoon. Looking back, I think maybe if I'd made him go to a treatment center early on in the relationship, things could have worked out for us. I don't know. Maybe it could have. Maybe it couldn't. After all, I know Walker did love me, and I loved him too. I don't remember when the abuse actually started. I just know that I should have seen the signs before it happened, I guess. It's just really hard to put it into words. It's just that things started to explode. Before I knew it, it was too late. Everything was out of control. Walker would start drinking before he left for work. He'd take his pain medicine, and I didn't know exactly how much he was taking, but I knew it was excessive. And after he got home, he started passing out. At first, it wasn't every night, and then it gradually became frequent. And it seemed as though he couldn't go through a single day without being strung out and drinking, um, or strung out on alcohol and drugs, I should say. He started to get more and more abusive. Finally, one day I caught him shooting up his pain medicine into his veins, and I thought, what in the world? And then I realized it was for a quicker high. I remember thinking I'd lost him. Anybody that would go so far as to shoot up was a lost soul, and I didn't know if I could help him. I was scared of him, especially when he was really high. And when I say scared, I mean really scared. All I could think was, why am I here? What am I doing? And then I thought, maybe it was his pain was so bad that he had no choice. That's what he had always said, that his pain was unbearable. And if he didn't take medicine, he'd end up in a wheelchair because he just couldn't function. Um, he just always threw that in. And even though I was a nurse, and by then I had already gotten my emergency technician license, and it was hard to know what I knew, but then see it in front of my eyes every day when I came home from work. And there was so many times that he'd hurt me, and then he'd say he's sorry, and it was the first time I'd ever gone through a domestic violence relationship. So you want to believe they see the light someday and they stop hurting you and they see that they've got to get help and you love them. So it's like you freeze not knowing what to do. You have all these thoughts. When can you implement them? When can you get them help? When can you try to make an abuser understand what's causing the abuse? And you just hear the apologies, and you hear so many of them. Soon they just don't mean nothing. Like I said, I was working at the local hospital, and I was an EMT and also working as a nurse, making me more mad than ever that I was in this situation. After all, I was around people in pain every day, and then to come home and see someone complaining of pain far worse than you could even imagine, it was just extremely a roller coaster ride. You never knew what to expect. And you always felt like there must be some way to get him help, to find a way to make him stop. After all, he was slowly killing himself. And I was struggling with that my husband was an addict, and I still cared about him so much. I asked myself a number of times why I didn't just have him hospitalized. Why didn't I just leave? I guess the answer, I was scared. I loved him. My life was in terrible shape. I was a fool. The doctors eagerly gave Walker any prescription he wanted. I remember I thought, am I the only one that sees his addiction? There seems to be drugs everywhere. Doctors were giving him mega doses. Now, I must throw in, Nowadays, it's a little different, but this was back in the early 80s, and we live in a rural community. Walker's family was very well to do, and it's hard to sit there and like not understand that at one point doctors eagerly gave out pain medicine, especially the people that had real injuries that were keeping them from having um, decent lives. And men have to work, so if a man comes in and complains and there's documented evidence that there is an actual injury, especially a spinal injury, um, a back injury, there at the time in the 80s, the doctors just gave the medicine. And I desperately tried to keep the kids away from him. I was constantly shuffling them back and forth between babysitter and my mother. I remember bits and pieces of our 2 years together. Things like him getting mad and holding me down and spitting or drooling in my face, which at the time seemed so disturbing, but overall, that was the most minor of the things that he did. I remember we had the kids at our house, and we were getting ready to eat one night, and his kids were there at our house, our apartment, and Walker was drunk as usual, and for some reason mad as hell at me. He threw his drink at me, and he threatened to throw a skillet of hot grease because I had cooked chicken. And he said it was so that I wouldn't look at him anymore. But his daughter Emily jumped in between us and begged for him to put the hot skillet down. I truly believe she saved my life that night. Walker set the skillet down and left the house. I think he even thought, even though he was high on drugs, he knew how close he had come to disfiguring me. One time he grabbed me by the throat and choked me into unconsciousness. The last thing I remember was blackness, like someone had turned the lights out. I remember praying for someone to help me. When I woke up, I found out that he had kicked me with his work boots on as I lay on the kitchen floor, and my chest was badly bruised, especially around my rib cage. Most of the really bad stuff happened, thankfully, when my kids were gone. And it started with nothing more than like a word. So I got pretty good at judging what the signs were. What if I'd had the kids? I had time to get my mom to come and get them before it got too bad. I remember my mom would come and get the kids and beg for me to come too. But Walker, he always drank heavily, and I knew it was just a matter of time before he'd blow a fuse, and I told her I had to stay. What if he burnt the apartment down? I told her to leave and I'd be okay, and I'd stay the whole night hiding under one of my kids' twin beds. I knew after he did his last dosage of Demerol, he'd start looking for me. I can still hear him calling my name walking through the house, but I never moved, not even an inch. I was scared he'd find me, and then he could accidentally kill me for even hiding from him. I remember I ended up having to urinate on myself, and I was praying that he would pass out. After he was out cold, I would be able to climb out and clean myself up or climb out and use the bathroom. All those times, it was it was scary. And I remember being I remember listening because sometimes I would feel like, yeah, he could have passed out, but what if he's awake? Or what if I wake him when I crawl out? I, it was just a roller coaster. It was like walking on eggshells every single minute. Um, Sometimes I'd come out from being hidden and I'd find that he'd broken some of my things. I knew no one would ever understand why I was still there. And to be honest, I didn't know why I was still there. Walker was lying passed out one night in the hallway. I remember I touched him to see if he was still alive, like I had done so many times before. Then I lay a blanket over him, wondering how much love did I still have for him. After all I had been through, I knew I still cared for that man that I saw laying at my feet, but I didn't dare wake him. I just crawled back into my hiding place and went to sleep crying, only to wake up at the slightest noise for fear that it might be him. God help me, please. You're probably wondering why I didn't leave. You probably think I was weak. I don't agree. I was afraid, and I felt like I'd been doing all I could under the circumstances. I remember being worried if he'd overdose, would I save him? I did still love him and care about him, but would I help him if he stopped breathing? I didn't know. One time he left in the dead of winter, drunk as could be. I called some of his friends to go look for him, and after a while they found him and brought him home. He'd pissed his pants, and I had him lay him in the floor. He hadn't worn shoes at all, and his feet were completely blue and severely frostbitten. I wasn't sure that I'd be able to handle him myself without calling for an ambulance. Eventually, I managed to get his feet warmed back up, and the color started to come back. Walker fought me when his feet started to actually feel pain, and it started to wake him up. It was sheer luck that night that he didn't lose any toes from the injury his feet had sustained. Most of the abuse I took from him, I tried to block out over the years. The words that were said, the mental torture he put me through, some of it still haunts me, and I know it always will be there. I'm not sure exactly when I decided to leave, but I knew I had to leave before he killed me. One of my last memories of Walker was truly horrifying and will stay with me the rest of my life. It was the 4th of July, 1985, and I was working. My stepdaughter called me from my house and said, "Daddy's drunk, please come home." I told her I'd be right there. By the time arrived, my mother-in-law was in the bedroom with Walker, and he was really strung out on both drugs and alcohol. He had all of his guns loaded, laying across the bed. It was like walking into a war zone, except I was at a loss as to what was really happening. The children were in the living room on the sofa, all of them, and I sent them out to the playground. Um, then I quietly called the police. Walker was in a whole different world. His mother was trying to convince him to put his guns away. He kept saying that someone was coming and that he had to be ready to fight. I remember he threatened to kill his own mom if she didn't leave him alone, but she just kept agitating him. I was working my way into the room and was begging with her not to press the issue. He was having some kind of wild hallucinations, and we were the enemy. Walker kept hearing things He was totally gone, and I knew it. He had surrounded himself with guns and ammo and was pacing back and forth. His mother was still trying to get him to come to his senses. Walker started swinging around a 30-06 rifle back and forth between his mother and me, saying that he would kill us if he had to, kill us both. I pulled her back towards where I was standing, and I can't remember if he moved over, but suddenly I was really close to the gun. I don't remember what possessed me to put my hand on the barrel and raise it up to the ceiling. But as I did, Walker pulled the trigger. I'll never forget the feeling of the gun when it went off. It shook my whole body and made my hair stand up on my skin. I was scared to death and my heart was pounding. I remember telling his mother to leave, and much to my surprise, she did. But she only left the room once she realized how close she had come to getting us both killed. Walker let the gun go, and he wasn't looking, so I laid it down next to the bed, and I told him I'd be right back, and that I had to go check on something. Walker started to calm down, and he just sat down on the bed. I think he knew I cared about him and was trying to help. When I got into the living room, the police were coming in the door with their guns drawn. Walker's mother was talking to them, and of course she was taking her son's side, saying he was just a little drunk. The police said that they would go get him, but I asked them to let me go first. I told them that he was much calmer now, and I thought it would be better if they followed me into the room. Don't ask me why I did that, because I I remember doing it, but it wasn't like I was brave. I just thought he might flip back into the hallucinations if I didn't go in first and keep him calm. Um, anyway, they followed me into the room. Walker was still trying to get ready for some kind of invasion, but when I said the police are here, he said, "Good, finally some help has come." Then he gave in quietly. Everyone was shocked at the arsenal he had. All the guns were loaded, but believe it or not, Walker didn't even go to jail. Back in the early 80s, or the middle 80s, that domestic violence was minor compared to what it is now. Like, they barely ask questions now because somebody is going to jail, if not both. But back then, it was like you could easily get by with something like that by saying, I was drinking, I was hallucinating, I was just trying to protect my family and they were trying to grab at me. Or you could just say whatever and it was passed off. After all, it was kind of like a family issue. And so, like I said, he didn't go to jail. They just took his guns away from him and sent him home with his mother. And he was allowed, or sent the guns home with his mother. He was actually just allowed to stay with me. And I thought, what? Didn't he just try to kill me? Walker's mom took the kids home with her. I stayed with Walker, but I kept my eyes on him constantly. I remember when I went back to work the next day, everyone was concerned for me. They'd heard over the police scanner that shots were fired at my address. Everyone was worried that he had shot me. Now everyone knew what was happening. I made up my mind that I had to get out of this mess before he actually did kill me. I got a restraining order against him, and when he was in for the hospital for his back surgery, because he had to have a touch up, I guess, from his back injury. And it had come kind of at the right time. I remember I called him and told him on the phone that he wouldn't be coming back to me, that it was finally over. I'd gone through enough and I was going to file for divorce. When Walker got out of the hospital, he came over to the house claiming he had to talk to me about the divorce and who gets what. I asked him to leave and he was pissed. Instead of fighting with him and having him kick in my door like he had done once before, I let him in. He followed me to my bedroom and all around the house talking constantly. I just pretended he wasn't there. We started to argue, and he said how much he wanted me, how he'd been thinking of it. I knew what was coming. I knew he wanted to have sex with me. I remember I said something like, "You have to be joking. It's over, Walker." Then he just threw me on the bed and proceeded to rape me. I thought if he thinks he's hurting me, he's wrong. I fought back a little, but then soon just lay there and let him do what he wanted. It didn't last that long, and he got up and said, "You know you like that." I just looked at him calmly and said, "Are you done? Because if you are, you've got to leave. I have things to do." He left, and I went and took a bath, scrubbing myself raw. I was so mad. Although I acted like it didn't bother me, it did. At that moment, I hated his guts. I hated the fact that I'd ever cared for him. Abuse is something that stays with you, and even if you get help, abuse is something you can never fully put behind you. At least I didn't. I tried to put it out of my mind, but it is ultimately a part of me. Something I'll never forget that I went through. That somehow I made peace with it. Although it was still difficult not to see the long-term effects that domestic violence has on every aspect of my life. Most people say that anyone living in an abusive relationship such as mine that I was in should just leave at the first sign of abuse. But you don't just wake up one day and walk out. You have to pick the time carefully so that your abuser doesn't just snap. After all, statistics and virtually any domestic violence victim will tell you that it takes very little to send an abuser over the edge. And there have been far too many instances in the past of abusers fatally killing not only the person being abused, but their entire family. I'd like to pass on some advice for anyone going through the same thing or something similar. If you are constantly scared, then get away. You may think it's better, or it could get better, but it won't. I know more than anyone how scary it is. But by comparison, staying in an abusive relationship is like living a nightmare. I was one of the lucky ones and I finally left. Please don't wait until it's too late. Just make a plan, a good plan, and leave. Deep down in my heart, I'm still scared of him. And sometimes I have flashbacks. He hurt me so many times, both physically and mentally. There were so many instances which I thought he was going to kill me. I would go to sleep and wake up with him on top of me, choking me as though I was the enemy. If I hadn't left, he might have ended up killing the children and me. It hurt a lot when I left him. After all, I still loved him. More than you can imagine. I remember feeling crushed when I left him. But I wasn't going to live in fear anymore. And I was worried for my kids. I had to get the courage up to get out and stay out. No one could tell me what I should do, but I had to think about what was in my heart more love or fear. Take it from me, You're stronger than you think. You're not a victim. You don't want to be a victim. You're a survivor, and I'm a survivor. Make up your mind and just do it. It's really hard, and there's going to be a lot of people that make it sound easy. But you'll be stronger for it. You will. You'll get through it, and you'll be stronger. Okay.